to deliver the first National Endowment Lecture.
അവനിവൻ എന്നതൊക്കെയോർത്താൽ അവനിൽ ആദിമമായൊരാത്മരൂപം അവനവൻ ആത്മസുഖത്തിനാചരിക്കുന്നവയവരന്നു സുഖത്തിനായി വരേണം. That is a verse from the രണയഭ and a succinct, brief exposition of the philosophy of Advaita, but different from Shankara, brought down to earth to actually address the differences among mankind. I articulated that in my respect to P.T. Kuriakose Marsh, who I understand is closely connected to Narayanan. Professor Sree, the Vice Chancellor of Sanskrit University, Professor K.T. Mathavan, the President of the Kerala Sanskrit Academy, Professor P. Narayanan, a very dear, I shouldn't call him friend, he's my senior colleague and also a kind of mentor for me, especially when it comes to questions in Sanskrit. Professor Vijayan, Professor Lalit Kumar Sahu, Professor Murli Mathavan, and other distinguished guests on the stage, dear faculty and students, and all other important people in the audience. No doubt this is a huge honor for me to be present here and also deliver the endowment lecture in this P.T. Kuriakose Memorial Endowment Program, not least because I am making a lecture, but also because it is so fortunate on my part to be part of a program in which my most esteemed Professor Narayanan is getting felicitated and honored, and also because it gives me a rare opportunity to sit alongside Professor Varakeli, to whom I have immense respect and regard. Professor Murli Mathavan mentioned that I shall speak about the secular traditions of Sanskrit. I've always been someone who never takes orders, so I chose not to do that. And while I was coming here, especially because it is in the context of P.T. Kuriakose Marsh, I seriously wondered what it should be that I should speak on. Professor Varakeli here indicated that huge span and scope of Sanskrit and the way in which, in different ways, despite the great differences within the country, Sanskrit has been that particular discursive medium through which the country has been held together. And that even before it became a political entity, it was a cultural entity identified, brought together by a number of discourses, a number of philosophies, all of which in one way or another were allied to Sanskrit and Sanskrit knowledge. Now, standing here today as someone who's outside the core of Sanskrit studies, but as someone who is connected with certain allied areas of Sanskrit studies in terms of theatre, in terms of my interest in philosophy, and lately having come to be in charge of a Sanskrit university, which hopefully I will be divested of pretty soon, and which would mean that I can return to my work of scholarship and study rather than administration. I'm waiting expectantly for that. But given these circumstances, the one question that has always plagued me, that has always interested me in a strange kind of curiosity, is a question of relevance. Let me put it another way. During my work on Kudiyatam for the past 20 years or so, the only surviving form of Sanskrit theatre, which is nearly 10 centuries of history. Some claim it is more and that it is 20 centuries, but that is rather doubtful. And despite looking at the riches of Kudiyatam, one question that has always come uppermost in my mind is, why is Kudiyatam relevant today? Is it because Kudiyatam is 1,000 years old or more? Is it because Kudiyatam presents on the stage some of the greatest plays ever written, not only in India, but the world over, where people like Max Muller or Goethe actually speak, wax eloquent when they speak about Sanskrit theatre? Or is it because there are certain kinds of theatrical methods within, or certain kinds of enactment methods within Kudiyatam, which is very interesting for us? Or is it just because it's a historical curiosity? Now, these questions acquire importance when we extend it beyond the Sanskrit theatre of Kudiyatam and look at Sanskrit itself in terms of these questions. Look at the other classical languages that we have in the world. Greek, for instance, Latin, Chinese, they've all had equally, if not greater, forms of enrichment, of contribution, of knowledge discourses, of literature, of shastras. Look at Tamil, for instance. Tamil is still something that is surviving and continuing, probably getting stronger each and every day. Now, why is it that probably Sanskrit requires an attention and propagation that you seldom find in the case of Latin or Greek or Chinese? In the case of Latin and Greek, for instance, you find very interesting cases of Latin and Greek, the great works in Latin and Greek being translated into the modern languages, which has happened in Sanskrit too. But there is very little effort to kind of propagate Latin and Sanskrit, Latin and Greek, or to institutionalize, as Professor Kalady puts it, to rejuvenate the idea of those languages in the way in which we find it here in Sanskrit. Now, my question here is, as is the case with any Sanskrit discourse, one has to put a Purva Bhaksha. And the Purva Bhaksha, even if it is proven wrong, it is okay, but it has to be strong. And my question is very simple. Is Sanskrit relevant today? And if it is relevant, why is it relevant? On the one hand, if we look at the histories of most modern Indian languages, what we find is that most of the riches of Sanskrit languages have already been translated in terms of the different traditions of literature, of shastras, of philosophy. They've all been translated into other languages. And again, as Professor Kalady indicated, a language like Malayalam, in which the vocabulary itself, the Padakosha itself, is nearly 70% Sanskrit, is there a need for Sanskrit? I know I'm being argumentative. I know I'm being challenging, but that's the whole idea of an academic discourse. It is very easy for scholars within Sanskrit to lay back, to sit back, assured about the value of their own language, of their own discipline, but it will also be necessary for them to ask the hard questions of themselves so they can come up with the right kind of answers. Now, when such translation is possible, and further translations are still possible, and when you look at modern Indian languages, you find that Sanskrit has been a major determining force in the constitution of these languages. Why is it that a language which is seldom spoken, a language which is seldom used in everyday discourse, a language which probably to the exclusion of a couple of villages in Karnataka is never used as a lingua franca of daily discourse, why should it need protection? Why should it need propagation? Is it merely because, as Professor Murli Madhavan said, it has got a history that goes back to the Arsha Bharata? Or it's got wealth, a great stretch of wealth in terms of knowledge within it? If that were the case, that really is not defense enough, I would submit. And this is where I would come up with another proposition, a proposition which is at one and the same time a recognition of certain inner strengths of Sanskrit, but at which time will also probably constitute a critique of Sanskrit scholarship as it is right now existing. When I was working on Kudiyatam, probably the most important aspect that occurred to me was the way in which the acting technique of Kudiyatam itself was constituted. In Kudiyatam, for instance, you have a verse which is actually enunciated at the beginning. So when it is actually enunciated, the verse is sung out aloud to the accompaniment of hand gestures and mudras, fully, entirely, following the exact order of the Sanskrit verse. But once that is done, on the second level, each part of that verse is taken in isolation, the Anvaya is brought out, and after the Anvaya is brought out, questions are asked in the same way as would happen in a Sanskrit traditional classroom, following what scholars here would identify as a Khandanvaya Pathati, where the verb is taken out and questions are asked of the verb so as to elicit what is the noun or what is the subject, what is the predicate, what are the adjectives, what are the adverbs, etc. But what happens in Kudiyatam, as in the case of Sanskrit teaching methods or pedagogy, is that through these question and answer methods, the entire value, literary as well as philosophical value of that verse is brought out step by step through stories, through old narratives, through references to the epics of the Puranas, to references probably to the great scholarly texts in Sanskrit. In other words, what happens through this interrogative method, question and answer method, as in Malayalam it is called Akamshi Chanvayikiva. In that particular method, what happens there is that the verse itself is opened up, and the verse throws out the great implications that are present within the verse. Now, what is interesting here is that this question and answer method is a method of argument, is a method of tarka in a certain manner of speaking. But that argument is not an argument for dissension. It is an argument that is finally directed towards the possibility of accommodation, to the bringing in of fresh interpretations, to the possibility of creating different interpretations that were never there before. One small example which you people will probably find so easy, so simple. In Ashcharya Chudamani, there is a particular section where Ravana, on going to meet Sita in Ashokavanika, suddenly remembers that the trees of Ashokavanika are all trees that he had brought from Swarga, from the heavens, and which he had taken with his own hands and planted in Lanka and made this Ashokavanika. And he uses a word that these trees are Swarga Vibhushana. After mentioning Swarga Vibhushana, what the actor does, so interestingly, is to actually step out of his own countenance as an actor, almost becomes a teacher with the audience, and asks, what is Swarga Vibhushana? On the first hand, Swarga Vibhushana is these trees where ornaments in Swarga. No, they are ornaments here. Second, he asks, is it just that? No. It was earlier the ornaments of Swarga, Swar, but now they are ornaments in Gavi. in earth, on earth. No, it's not over. Then he asks, is that all? No, it's more than that. It is Swarga Vibhushana. These are trees which were ornamented, embellished by the birds of Swarga. What is interesting here is there is a morphological analysis, a morphological parsing of that particular, shall we say, compound word in order to bring out the different interpretations possible, the different readings possible through this question-answer method. What is important in this question-answer method is that it institutionalizes a formal method of dialogue, which probably Mimamsakas will understand much better. A formal method of dialogue, a dialogue which is not, shall we say, directed towards conflict, but a dialogue which is directed towards resolution, a final conclusion. When Amartya Sen speaks about argumentative Indian, we should also probably think about an accommodative, an Indian which is where the argument is not directed towards the creation of binary opposites, but the resolution of binary opposites, not merely in terms of the creation of differences, but the bridging of differences. And this methodology, on the one level, or on another level, a paddhati itself, a kind of approach, this approach makes it extremely crucial probably today. And that is where one should probably think in terms of the way Sanskrit pedagogy itself can be used as a critique of the colonial system of education and the colonial method of thinking, which is primarily based upon the idea of the rejection of the past, of the rejection of earlier systems of knowledge, and in terms of dissent and conflict. I can't emphasize this more. Exactly because, and I'll tell you why, this particular method is for Sanskrit scholars to wonder how much of that do we actually employ in our scholarship? How much of that do we actually employ in order to extend the scholarship itself? I'll give you one more example in the same way. It is a very oft repeated phrase, description that Sanskrit scholarship or Sanskrit theorization, the Shastras and the Siddhantas, are largely taxonomical in nature. They're based upon classifications. Whether it is from Panini, where he starts with the idea of Shabda, Varna, Pada, Vakya, and then Mahakavya, or in the Natya Shastra, where different forms of Agneya are found out in terms of Chaturvitha, or any other Shastras, this classificatory imagination, this taxonomical imagination is central to almost all these Shastras. In a certain sense of speaking, there is a scientific method there which clearly bases itself upon three particular processes. The first one is observation, the second one is description, and the third one is testing or experimentation. And when it comes to testing, it is a testing of this basic pre-theory or beta theory, as we may call it in today's terms, in terms of other possibilities with the view of extending it. Take the case of the Dasharupakas. The first form of the Dasharupakas was a very small, very skimpy list. But later on, those Dasharupakas themselves were, through the tradition of Natya Shastra and following that, the Dasharupakas were extended to bring in Uparupakas and further explanations and further kinds of description, so that the taxonomy itself extended, got elaborated. What is very interesting here, and I need to actually, shall I say, put this before you in terms of a great possibility. This is a formal method of analysis, not based on the ideas, not based on the meaning, but a formal method of analysis which makes it possible for it to include further and further and further instances into its basic format, so that at one and the same time, new instances are brought in while extending the possibility of taxonomy, while not questioning the taxonomy itself. I don't know if I'm communicating this properly. But this taxonomical imaginary, basically what is important here is that it is something that is open-ended, something that is open-ended towards the future, something that is always ready to accept the possibility of newer instances being brought in, so that the taxonomy itself does not get questioned but gets elaborated. The reason I brought these two things, ideas forward in this lecture, this short lecture, is very simple. What I find, I may be wrong, I will be very happy if I'm corrected. With most scholarship that I've seen in Sanskrit these days, interestingly enough, what is happening is not following these two traditions, where there is a tendency and the possibility of questioning those texts, not with an aim to demolish them, but with an aim of extending them, enriching them, or adding to the taxonomy itself in order to change or transform them. What we find is a certain kind of respect, reverence to the canonical. The idea of the canon is not Indian. The idea of the canon is Western. The idea that certain texts are unquestionable, certain texts are there almost as inspired by some divine intelligence, and something that can never be questioned but only accepted with reverence. What I find, especially from my experience of looking at work in theatre, and also to some extent in connection with Vedanta, etc., is an acceptance of the old texts as canons, unquestionable ones, in light of which other texts are interpreted, in light of which other phenomena are interpreted. The dialogue is lost. What is so important in Sanskrit, I would submit, yes, there are knowledges inside, yes, there are several kinds of insights, and as Professor Kalady said, there are so many allied disciplines connected with different forms of different aspects of life. But what is probably most important is this formal approach, this formal method of creating knowledge. It is an epistemology, so to speak, an epistemology which makes possible a dialogue across time, a dialogue between Bhasa and someone today, a dialogue between Panini and someone today, a dialogue between, say, Bhartrihari and someone today. Are we engaging in such a dialogue? Is a question I'd like to pose to the Sanskrit scholars here. Please prove me wrong. I'll be the most happy person if I'm proven wrong. Thank you very much.